I will be your moderator for tonight. My name is Patsy Makabuag. I'm from Migrant Forum in Asia. So welcome to the People's Migration Challenge. This is our wi- this is our session tonight will focus on migrants' rights advocacy. What are the urgent and key relevant issues in terms of migrants' rights advocacy in different regions? And we have uh, a distinguished set of speakers for this evening. And I will introduce our speakers first before we move on to their interventions. So our first speaker is Ms. Ellen Sana, Executive Director of the Center for Migrant Advocacy, um, and also a member of Migrant Forum in Asia. Second speaker is Alma Makwitiko, the Executive Director of the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. And then our third speaker, we have Philip Nanga, coordinator of 1MA. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing the names correctly. Please correct me if I'm wrong when you introduce yourselves, our panel of speakers. So today's discussion will focus on what are the most urgent and relevant issues in terms of migrants' rights advocacy in the different regions, and what do you envision migrants' rights advocacy to be for the sector, or migrants' rights advocacy in your region? What are the challenges and possibilities for your region? So um, since we are a little bit delayed tonight, I would like to call on now our first speaker, Ms. Ellen Sana. If you can begin your session, your intervention. Thank you very much for taking time to be in this webinar today. Ellen?
Thank you. Am I audible? Thank you, Tatsi. And
Yes.
warm greetings to all of us here in the Zoom under the People's Migration Challenge, the John K. Bingham Memorial Series. I'm, I'm saying the full name because I think especially today is a good day to be part of this migration challenge conversation because we remember our dear friend John Bingham on his birthday today. So I hope I am correct in my information. Maybe Eva can confirm that today is John's birthday. So I'm happy that I am participating in today's migration conversation.
Yesterday.
Yes, is it today?
Yesterday.
Yesterday.
Yesterday,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
yesterday.
still not too late. Yeah. So that's one. The second is the topic seems to be broad. And so for today's conversation, please indulge me. I would like to focus on the issue of women migrants from Asia, and also to share some progress in our advocacy for the promotion of the rights of women migrants from Asia. As I am also part of, apart from my affiliation, of course, with the Center for Migrant Advocacy and also with the Migrant Forum in Asia, I'm also in the a newly formed organization or network, which is called the Migrant Women Forum. And I would like to take this opportunity to share with all of you about the latest in the promotion of the rights of women migrant workers in Asia. As some of you, or if not most of you, maybe most of you, I hope, are aware of, when the Migrant Forum in Asia was founded or established in early 1990s, it was by women migrant rights advocates. So a group of women, mostly from Hong Kong and Malaysia and the Philippines, gathered together and the agenda that they set forth on the need to form a regional advocacy network was around the issue of promoting the rights of women migrants in Asia, from Asia. So that was in 1990s. And since then, what we try to do to manifest this concern of putting at the core of all our advocacies in the region on migrant workers, women migrant workers, is we form task forces to address the gender dimension and women migration concerns in the Asian region. Fast forward, this concern and interest and priority to address the issue of women migrants culminated in 2019 with the coming together not only of the Migrant Forum in Asia network, but we were joined by another regional organization. It's called the CCRM, the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, which is also a network by itself, and the WIN Pacific network. So we've reached out to these two other big groups of networks, and we decided that it would be good to solidify this commitment to promoting the rights of women migrants from Asia and the Pacific and Africa, or as we call it, as women migrants from the South, to come together and consolidate and discuss our agenda and our strategies in promoting the rights of women migrants. So that was in 2019, and then COVID came, and 2013, finally, in June 5 to 7, we had a 3-day convening of the first assembly of the Women Migrant Forum, which was held in Jakarta, Indonesia, and was participated in by some 50 women leaders, women migrant leaders, advocates, and representatives of various organizations from Asia, the Pacific, of course, the Middle East, and African region. And we were also joined, of course, by no less than women migrant workers themselves who are active also in the destination countries. And in those 3 days, we try to share our issues, our struggles, our successes as well, and how we can move further forward the advocacy for the promotion of women migrants' rights. So advocacy to include more visibility for the articulation of the women migrants agenda, for the recognition, proper valuation of women migrants' contribution to development in both countries of origin and destination, and for them to take up their issues not only in our origin and destination countries, but also try to be heard in regional and global platforms. So those 3 days ended with commitments, recommitments of individuals, and as well as their organizations to pursue this work towards the betterment and protection and empowerment of women migrants in Asia. So that's one good news that I should look happy. So that is that I wanted to share today, and we are looking forward to having more conversations with and by the women themselves. Of course, during the 3 days, we celebrated one big advocacy that we issued, that we campaigned for example, the recognition and respect for domestic workers, and recognition that domestic work is work, and this is manifested in the adoption of the ILO Convention on 89 in 2011. We also celebrated that the CEDAW, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 2008, adopted General Recommendation 26, which would guide member states of of the CEDAW, those that have ratified the CEDAW, which is almost universal, can use how the articles and provisions of the CEDAW can be used on cases of women migrant workers, particularly the low-wage migrant women workers. So we celebrated that. We also, of course, recalled that Convention 190 on harassment and violence in the workplace is something that is very much significant or relevant also to women migrant workers. Definitely, we recall also regional instruments in the ASEAN consensus and also the anti-trafficking, and how these instruments may strengthen and facilitate empowerment of women migrant workers from the region. At the same time, definitely recognize the many challenges that keep on haunting our women migrant workers. Especially, you will recall that the Philippines, for example, have had more than enough of our share in cases of violence being committed against women migrant workers. And these are recurring issues, old and until now are persistent issues that we must be able to address: gender-based violence, and of course, all of those deficits that women migrant workers are confronted with in terms of their enjoyment of their rights at work, enjoyment of social protection in the short term, medium term, and also in the long term. They have been excluded in the ambit of protection of labor laws and social laws of many countries, including in the destination countries. And there is a lack of recognition, definitely, as I said earlier, of the contribution of women in the development in both origin and destination countries. So this issue of exclusion, also the issue of discrimination, which is more felt by women as they are disproportionately concentrated in jobs that border on precarity, informality, and of course also very much characterized by low wages and deficits in social protection. These things we should continue to address. But hopefully this time around with the women themselves, the women migrants themselves, together with the advocates from the region, we would be able to have these voices more strongly heard in various forums, not only within our region, but also in global forums, and to bring also our perspectives from the global south in many of these platforms where this various conversations on women migrants take place. So maybe I will stop there and maybe hoping for a next round of interventions. Thank you. Over to you, Tats.
Thank you, Ellen, for emphasizing on that in Asia there is a need on the work in Asia and the need for representation for women migrant workers and for women migrants rights advocates from the South, and for women migrants themselves to be able to articulate their issues and the need to organize and mobilize the women migrant workers from Asia, and to have more voices of women from the South. Thank you for sharing about the work. Before I go on to the next speaker, just a follow-up question for Ellen. How can this work of the Migrant Women Forum and the advocacy with women migrant workers intersect with other movements? How do you envision this linking up with other movements, the broader social justice movement? Ellen?
Yeah, for sure. Again, as we always say, one, migration is a multifaceted phenomenon. The issues that the workers, the migrant workers and women workers in particular are confronted with intersect with issues of women, with issues of workers, with issues of farmers, and with issues of development, for example, with issues of health. So all these things intersect with the many concerns of migrant workers, particularly women migrant workers. And thus, we should be able to relate and work more effectively and reach out to the broader social movement, because what they advocate for in terms of transformation should be something that will benefit the migrant workers. Because in the first place, for example, as in the case of many migrants in Asia, including especially women migrant workers, they migrate out of compulsion, maybe because they are not able to to find decent job opportunities in their own countries of origin, or maybe they have to escape domestic violence, etc. And therefore, I think it would be to the interest of the women migrants to not to isolate themselves and just be confined in, for example, in the Women Migrant Forum, but surely to this Women Migrant Forum should be able to facilitate and hasten the connection with other social movements or with the broader social movements that aim to address empowerment and address equality and address poverty. So maybe I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for sharing your thoughts on this, and thank you for also sharing that you work with other social justice movements, with a broader social justice um, organizations in terms of promoting the issues of migrant workers, and the looking at the intersectionality of migration with broader development issues, and working also with other organizations in the region. Now I would like to request our next speaker. Um, Similar to what Ellen has shared, if you can also share what is what you think are the urgent and relevant issues in your region. What is your vision in terms of migrants' rights advocacy in your region, and what are the possibilities and the key challenges? I'd like to call on Alma Makito from the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Greetings, everyone. My name is Alma Makitico, and I live and work on the US-Mexico border. So my perspective is really going to be centered from this political location. I think we all know that for decades, contemporary border and migration regimes have been connected to increases in human rights violations and suffering on migrants, refugees, and border communities. And this is not only at the border, but it's also in the spaces of transit and waiting in detention centers, in migration corridors. And this has been connected to increases in mortality rates, in sexual and gender violence, and kidnappings and extortions, and immigration enforcement abuses, as well as high rates on mental and emotional trauma, on refugees and migrant communities. The violence that we experience as a result of militarized immigration enforcement and deterrence, it really compounds on the tremendous trauma and inequalities that migrants and border communities have been facing in their countries of origin and in transit. There's been many reports in our region that have documented that communities, migrants and in communities in Central America and Mexico have experienced high rates of murder, disappearances, violence, the proliferation of arms that Oftentimes, it's the U.S. that push those arms into those migrant-sending countries, and also, all of those crises compounded with climate change, with the hurricanes, are creating an enormous crisis of displacement. The concern, one of the primary concerns here is that the border it's really, it has become, as one of the most areas where some of the most brutal intersectional oppressions are reproduced here, and I'm talking about inequalities in terms of ethnicity, in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of legal documentation, like all those intersectional problems that we see elsewhere. It almost feel like they're confronted and compounded here at the border. Borders not only impact migrants and refugee communities, but also police in many ways the mobility of people of color. In our region, we experience many forms of militarized surveillance technologies and policing technologies or devices, including the use of drones, cameras, sensors, and checkpoints. So most of us have to regularly transit through checkpoints, and most people of color experience racial discrimination in these places. There's this culture of cruelty has also been amply documented by many of our partners and colleagues. Until yesterday, there were 275 people that were killed or that perished in the hands of U.S. Border Patrol authorities. Many of these people were killed in chases, other ones in fatal encounters, direct encounters with Border Patrol agents, and others died of neglect because of medical attention was not provided in a timely manner. But this is only like a little tip of the iceberg, and these fatalities are only U.S. citizens or people who were regular residents of the border. So we're talking about how these border infrastructure, it really makes geography or spaces of violence. In addition to that, I think one of the what I call the epicenter of border violence is actually the crisis of migrant deaths. There's almost 9,000 people that have been found. We're talking about remains, bodies or skeletal remains of migrants that have been found by accident, actually, on the U.S.-Mexico border. But the crisis of migrant deaths is much larger than that. It's almost impossible to be quantified, just because one, the nature of transiting in or migrating in an irregular manner does not really allow, or people take really dangerous routes to try to avoid being detected. And the other thing, it's because there's really not a concerted effort on behalf of the U.S. government and other governments around the world to really address the issue of migrant deaths as one of the most urgent issues in contemporary migration and border governance. We're talking about we have a crisis of prevention. We do not have regular pathways for people of color, for poor people of color. We do not have sufficient mitigation efforts to really prevent that people right now perish or connect remains to their missing loved ones. There's really not multilateral efforts to really create databases for people to really locate their missing loved ones. And there's also not sufficient commitment on behalf of governments to really create pathways that really ensure that people are migrating with the rights, that the rights are protected and recognized from their countries of origin, through transit, and at borders. So I think that it's imperative that we look at migration governance, or we look at these contemporary migration dynamics as in the context of migration governance, and not with the eyes of migration management. Because I think it is the approach of migration management that is creating this crisis. Whereas if we look at this through a migration governance lens, it allows us to look at the different crisis, not of migration, it's a crisis of displacement, that I think it's something that we have to look at, and that we're substituting the issue, or discussing the issue of migrants' presence at the border, instead of really addressing the challenges of like global inequality and climate change. So we cannot continue to do that. And I think in terms of organizations that are working for the rights of migrants, we have a tremendous opportunity to work from a human rights framework, and from a racial justice framework as well, to really recognize the embedded and the structural inequalities that migrants are facing in their migration journeys. So I'll stop there, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you very much for putting emphasis once again on the urgency to address the issues at the border, the violence experienced by the migrants, as we discuss this PMC tonight. We also just are just 1 week before, we also heard about the news in Europe, where more than 100 migrants also perished at sea, and where many are still missing. So there really is an urgency to address the issues at the border. And thank you for emphasizing on the need for stronger advocacy, and the need to advocate for stronger rights-based migration governance in many regions, instead of what governments are looking at, migration management, and to push for rights-based migration governance in the region. Thank you also for emphasizing on the need for regular pathways, which we have been discussing a number of times already in this People's Migration Challenge, as one of the objectives also of the Global Compact for Migration, to facilitate regular pathways for migration. We have had a number of webinars on this, and a number of discussions on this. And thank you for sharing what is currently happening in the US side of in terms of migrants' rights advocacy. Maybe now, because we started a little bit late, we will have a second round of questions for our speakers, but I would like to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker, I believe, will be speaking in French. For those who are not familiar with Zoom, we have interpretation in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic in this webinar. So if just click the globe icon in your Zoom to move to the English channel, or the Arabic or Spanish channel for interpretation. I'd like to call on our next speaker now, Philip Nanga, the current coordinator of Un Monde Avenir. Am I pronouncing that right? Philip, are you online? Is
Je
Philip
suis
online?
avec vous.
Yes.
Bonjour à tout le monde.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes,
Hello.
good
Yes.
morning,
So
all.
welcome. So
Can you hear me
my
well?
question
He's
for you
asking.
for this webinar, for today, Africa as a non-state actor, perspective, emerging challenges for migrants on the continent, and um, the African non-state actor perspective on emerging challenges for migrants on the continent and pertinent issues of civil society. If you can share a little bit about this, it would also be good to hear your views on recent events, the attacks in the sub-Saharan migrants in Tunisia and the conflict in Sudan, as we understand that they have affected a lot of people and have affected the region. So please go ahead.
Merci de me donner la
Thank you.
parole.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and I hope that you are able to follow me, because unfortunately we are in an environment where the network is not really very fine. So sometimes we may have lots of interruptions, and you understand that this is because of the circumstances where I am now. Now, with regards to our opinion regarding the different opinions that and what is happening now, you talked about Tunisia, you talked about Morocco, about Algeria, also Congo, Cameroon as well, Guinea, where we have lots of problems as well. So we have to say that unfortunately this issue of refoulement that we have in Africa for people and that comes from the north. This is also an issue that we have to address at the level of the South, because unfortunately we have some violations against the migrants from our own continent. I was in Morocco, and I was in Rabat and in Agadir. And I was a bit in working with the people and who are working on this issue of repression or refoulement. On the one hand, we have some improvement, but we have some other practices that are remaining very difficult. And for us, these are very or let's say that these are the copy of what is happening at the international level, because migration has become a problem by the politicians and with the politicians. The politicians are the ones who have fabricated this problem. Previously, the migration was something that was normal. People used to pass from one country to another without any problem. But after the migration has become politicized and being labeled as a problem, so this has led to lots of problems. And the Africans also started talking about this issue of refoulement or repression. And unfortunately, we have seen this with lots of people who have said lots of bad things on the social media and also at the African Union. They also in Tunisia, or the Tunisian president said something, and the African Union has intervened. And also in Morocco, we have seen some disasters with people who were either arrested or killed because they were passing. And this is something that is happening on a daily basis in these areas. In Africa, we have a very big concern, which is the externalization of the European frontiers or borders. Everything that we are describing today, like, for example, what is happening in Mauritania, in Libya, in Senegal, Morocco, so these countries that have borders with Europe, and we are living this externalization of the European borders. Consequently, we are not touching the migrants on the European soil. No, they want to block them on the African soil, and consequently, this leads us to some inhuman politics and policies, because there are some practices that are completely new. So this struggle now is led through our daily declarations that we are having. For example, you have to know that in Africa, there are some people who to pass from an area to another, they have to pay for some visas or to have a title of residency. And this is also done because of the corruption that we have on the borders. So these are scandals that we are living on a daily basis when we are doing our work and when we are observing what is happening on the borders. Consequently, today, and with regards to perspectives, we are trying to mobilize the African states and to design some human migration policies that correspond to the African culture or the universal culture that is a culture of mobility. We want to plead with our countries for these migration policy to be in conformity with the African culture, i.e. the solidarity, because Africa has always had these characteristics of solidarity. So we do not want to have any migration policies where we have some frontiers and barrages. So this is the struggle that we are leading today, and we are denouncing the externalization of the borders in Africa. Consequently, if the Europeans do not want the Africans to migrate, at least they can wait for them there and not come here in Africa and work on their own control here. So this is for us something that we are working on, and also we want Africa to be in itself in conformity with the international standards to protect the migrants, because we can imagine that the African migration migration, it is at 90% from south to south, and the 10% are going to Europe. Consequently, for this issue, do we have these problems even inside Africa? Consequently, recently we are really struggling for the African states to organize themselves, not only to have migration policies that will be facilitating migration within Africa, but also for the young people's general conditions to be improved, and for the youth not only to feel the need to leave. So this is the main work that we're working on. So we have two levels of work: a level that is tackling the political or the policies issues for these policies to be African and within the African culture. And at the second level is in general, because these scandals that we are living and seeing people who are dying to leave because the situation where they're living is really disastrous, because we have some states with catastrophic governance. Consequently, this leads us to two other levels. So we are first advocating for the migration on the one hand and for the development on the other hand. This is why in this perspective we are trying to have a good collaboration amongst organizations that are working in Africa and the civil society organizations that are working in the diaspora. So we think that one of the solutions to humanize this migration is to have these very good relations between the Africans on the one hand in Africa and the African diaspora all over the world, because if we are able to get in touch and to build bridges between these two sides, we will be influencing the migration policies at all levels. So these are more or less the challenges that we are facing, and these are the advocacy policies that we're advocating for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for sharing, for letting us know the situation in Africa, the key issues, your advocacy in the region, and for emphasizing on the externalization of borders, what is currently happening between Africa and Europe, and also for taking the time to do this, to attend this webinar, even if you are in transit. Thank you very much for that. In the interest of time, we still have another speaker, which I forgot to introduce earlier. So we would like to move on to our next speaker. representative of Migration in the Youth Children Platform. We have Milena from the Migration, Youth and Children Platform. I understand that you are now online. Yes, thank you for joining us tonight for the episode 6 of the John Kennedy Bingham Memorial Series. So, Milena, if you could share with us some of your thoughts in terms of what are the priority issues for youth and children right now. What do you see will be the priority advocacies, and share a bit about your work for our webinar today. Please go ahead. Please unmute yourself there.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm very glad to be part of the discussion today, which is a very important one, considering the news we have also received last week from Europe. My name is Milena. I am indeed representing the Migration, Youth and Children Platform, and I'm a human rights lawyer currently working for the International Criminal Court as the chair of the Middle East and North Africa Working Group. We have seen that young migrants are often described as the most vulnerable among vulnerable people, and recent statistics show how non-EU born youth still have the highest unemployment rate in the European Union. We have led European regional consultations on youth perspectives and priorities on this topic, for which we consulted 16 locally based youth-led and youth-focused organizations with national or international focus, acting in 23 countries and representing around 2,300 youth overall. One of our key youth-led and youth-focused projects, which we have identified, where that European youth organizations are at the forefront in addressing the problem of youth unemployment, with projects aiming to address its structural causes, including providing technical and vocational education and training to young migrants in line with labor market needs, promoting young migrants' mental health as a tool for personal development, and to allow better integration in host societies by offering safe spaces, information, counseling, and psychological support. Also raising awareness among vulnerable populations on the topic of safe migration and future employment perspectives, and encouraging and facilitating young migrants to intern in local organizations in order to improve future job opportunities, making available documentation that recognizes the skills acquired. However, we are still missing out on the potential of young people when we don't recognize their education level and qualifications. We're also calling on stakeholders and state institutions to ensure that we are creating and implementing lean pathways and regulations to facilitate the recognition of foreign qualifications. A good example that could be widely adopted is the European Qualifications Passport, which is a document providing information about higher education qualifications of migrant population based on available documentation and a structured interview. Youth are also working to educate and raise awareness about labor risks and rights. This has limited impact without governments and private sectors entities' commitment to uphold and respect anti-exploitation measures and labor rights, including concerning wages and safety for all migrants, irrespective of the status. We have also seen that European youth have been working in partnership with other entities and sectors to realize migration-related goals, specifically for the 2030 agenda. And those include the inclusion of young migrants and refugees in key decision-making roles in Europe, such as part of the advisory board within relevant organizations, ensuring migrants and refugees are not left behind in any of those achievements regarding the migration-related goals, the implementation and lead of European exchange projects for which young European Union citizens acquire skills to ideate and replicate projects addressing migrants' needs, and advocate for a youth guarantee scheme, which currently exists in the European Union, to the youth in the non-EU countries, including refugee youth in transit and local youth planning to immigrate. We have also seen that globally, the number of people displaced has reached its highest number, staggering a number of 110 million. Many of the people that attempt to make the desperate trek across the Mediterranean Sea have been driven from their homes by rising food insecurity, unemployment, the impact of climate change, with some fleeing violence, conflict, or persecution. The vast majority of people attempting the Mediterranean crossing pass through Libya first, where they're often exposed to horrific levels of violence, including kidnapping, torture, and extortion. A common route taken by many migrants, called the Central Mediterranean route, stretches from the sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, including Libya, and across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. It is one of the world's most dangerous routes existing currently. We have also seen in February 2023 that another more 100 migrants died when a boat carrying 200 migrants amidst harsh weather conditions sank while trying to land on the coast of southern Italy. Even before the deaths last year, at least more than 1,000 people were known to be missing from the central Mediterranean crossings this year. And the real number is likely to be far higher, as many wrecks are not recorded. We've been also following the sources of the International Organization of Migration, which has tallied more than 27,000 missing migrants in the Mediterranean since 2014. In addition to the deadly central Mediterranean route, the Western Mediterranean used by migrants seeking to reach Spain from Morocco or Algeria. We have also seen that too many governments have created best options for establishing order at borders. However, these solutions push people into the hands of smugglers to get past checkpoints across borders and ultimately onto boats. We have also seen that EU leaders must address the ongoing crisis in the Mediterranean. Saving lives is not a crime. We have identified that the lack of spaces for discussion and engagement in Europe is an obstacle for strengthening local, regional, and networking policy discussions. Governments and other stakeholders should help create specific physical and virtual spaces dedicated to share views, information, and best practices among the stakeholders working in the migration field in Europe to build upon accomplishments and to identify opportunities for further cooperation. The involvement of the private sector as well as civil society is crucial. Only the jurisdictions that treat their youth migrant workers with dignity can benefit from their contribution to the economy. However, in European countries, it is common to identify protectionist measures when it comes to their job markets and to tolerate the exploitation and abuse of migrant workers. We have led another European regional consultation on youth perspectives on this topic and identified the following projects in addition to the previous one I've just mentioned, on raising awareness on union rights and precarious and exploitative working conditions, specifically for young migrants, as well as promoting market responsive insertion of young migrants in the labor market. Also to conduct research and collect data about the labor conditions of young migrants in European countries and sharing the evidence with relevant stakeholders and international conferences. There is also a need to provide mental health support services to vulnerable youth migrants who have experienced sexual abuse and other forms of exploitation, with special attention to intersectionality, including gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, and migration status. We are also advocating for the support and referral services for undocumented young migrants who are working in European countries with unbelievable conditions to guarantee a labor rights protection. We are also advocating for refugees and asylum seekers' rights to decent employment, the establishment of non-discriminatory national social protection systems, and to fight derogative measures. However, to realize the potential contribution of young migrants and refugees to the economy and prosperity of local communities, we need to give them a chance to access decent employment rather than pushing them into informality. For this reason, we have been calling for the past year on governments and the private sector to collaborate to remove discriminatory laws on young migrants and promote the creation of market-responsive, flexible labor mobility schemes, which should include lean pathways to facilitate the recognition of the transnational education of qualifications and skills. As youth, we stand ready to support the identification of good practices. In fact, youth are leading initiatives to conduct research on the situation of migrants, as we can see in Europe, as well as create evidence-based policies to monitor the implementation. Vulnerable young migrants, including because of migration status, victims of trafficking, members of minorities, and of gender identity, need specific support and attention to ensure that they do not become victims of further exploitation, particularly in countries like Greece and Italy. As youth, we are leading projects for this, including to deliver mental health support and the legal refer services to scale up and increase our impact. However, we also need governments and stakeholders to invest and help us expand our projects. We have also seen in September 2022 that the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court joined the national authorities in the Joint Team on Crimes Against Migrants in Libya, which particularly also affects young migrants who are crossing the Mediterranean Sea to reach Europe. Part of these national authorities were from the countries of Italy, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Spain. The team is also supported by the European Union Agency for Law Enforcement Cooperation. This makes sure that we are targeting the most vulnerable members of society, those who have no ability to assert the core human rights. We have also received a lot of information indicating that young migrants and refugees, especially undocumented migrants under the age of 18, have been subjected to arbitrary detention and forced labor. We hope that any cooperation and any advocacy in Europe could lead to an effective change to prevent further news of what we have reached last week. And I will stop here right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Milena, for your intervention. It's very important to have the voices of youth in all our discussions, and we are happy to have you as part of today's session. Thank you for sharing about your work, for sharing about the issues that the youth is looking at, particularly in terms of addressing discrimination against young people and looking at issues of undocumented young migrant workers, and how these can be addressed in our advocacy. Thank you very much to all our speakers for your intervention and for sharing about the different aspects of advocacy in the different regions from Asia, North America to Africa, and from the representative, our representative from the youth. Now I would like to call on from our participants, from the webinar attendees, if anyone would like to speak, share about urgent advocacies and what advocacy should look like from what your vision in terms of urgent advocacies that need to be done in your region. We welcome inputs now from the floor, from our participants. If anyone would like to speak or share, please raise your hand. Anyone who would like to share from the region or would like to share about other urgent, relevant issues that we need to look at in terms of our advocacy, please don't hesitate to share. I see Fambaye raising her hand. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Madame la modératrice. Vous avez bien prononcé mon nom.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You have well pronounced my name. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Asks the speaker.
Yes, we
can you hear me?
Je suis audible.
Oui, on t'entend très bien.
Voilà. Voilà, merci beaucoup.
So thank you very much. So my name is Fambaye Ndoye. I am head of department in charge of migration on the National Union of the Senegalese Trade Union. I'm as well in charge of the Network for the Support of Women and Children in Migration. I would like to thank those who have preceded me when it comes to the pertinence of the points that they have mentioned, especially Mr. Philippe Nanga for his presentation. And I believe that the strategic actions that he has mentioned are to be adopted thoroughly. Allow me to add two further points, especially the ones that are related to an experience that we've had further to a study that we conducted in cooperation with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation on migrant women, further to the COVID pandemic, and the study that was mainly focused on the working and the living conditions of migrant women and on the situation or the condition of those women when it comes to their impact further to the COVID-19 outbreak. And therefore, we have seen that there was, of course, a lack of decent work for migrant workers. And this is why it is very important to have a very strong advocacy to ensure that those migrant women can be capable of accessing decent work in the countries, in the host countries. This is, of course, related to a proper support of their work, and in addition to a professional activity, especially that most of them are working in the informal economy and do not have a proper training on the economic activity per se, especially when it comes to the African countries. The other problem is related to access to funding. When we talk about access to funding, which is a matter of great concern when it comes to the social integration of these women in the social fabric of those countries. It is very important to provide access to the funding and facilities in accessing funding. And this is why this should go hand in hand with an inclusive system when it comes to accessing credit with regard to these countries. Another problem is now related to the initiatives that these countries have taken post-COVID and for the economic restructuring or for the economic revival. Often the migrants are excluded from the national resilience projects, especially when we talk about the economic activities. And I think that advocacy should mainly focus on these issues so that those systems can better integrate the migrants as well as the foreigners who are living in these countries, because since they constitute an integral part of the economic spectrum, then these individuals need to pursue their activities and need to have the facilities that are necessary on the national level to be capable of having more productive activities and to be capable of accessing work that would facilitate decent life. When it comes to our network, we are currently in the course of developing several activities with our only partner for the time being, which is the Friedrich Ebert Institution. We are training women on their right to better defend themselves. In order to defend one's rights, you need first to know those rights. We're trying to actually talk about economic empowerment, and we are as well encouraging them to be better introduced to the administrative steps necessary to have a regular status on the level of those countries and to facilitate access to all the opportunities that might exist. We have as well been capable of organizing institutions and funding institutions. I'm sorry, we lost the speaker or he's muted. Okay, we hear him back. Thank you. And if time allows, I would like to talk about access to education of those migrant children. This access to education, which is a serious problem. It is an administrative problem which is related to their status, because there are most of the time children who are suffering from problems. We are talking about children who come from the sub-region in the Senegal, and we're talking about the children who do not have any birth ID and who often encounter difficulties in accessing schools and in having education, even if we're talking about a basic education or a primary education. This is everything I have to say. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It was a pleasure to listen to you. And as I have read in the chat, we are willing to integrate all the spaces in order to better improve the working conditions of women and children. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing about the issues of women and children, especially from Africa, and for for sharing about the challenges and also what needs to be done. Anyone else from the floor who would like to share before I go back to our speakers? Yes, Paddy. I see that you have raised your hand. Please go ahead. Paddy, please go ahead. We cannot hear you.
Audible? Am I audible now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you now.
Fantastic. Thank you for the great moderation. And a pleasure to be here this afternoon and listening to our panelists sharing. Sorry about that. Had to find a quiet corner in the midst of a busy house. You know, thank you to all the panelists for sharing these regional experiences, which I think for us as also co-organizers of the People's Migration Challenge are always pertinent, but I think they often remind us as well why, you know, why we actually come together and ask not just panelists, but also listening into the audience in terms of the critical issues that migrants continue to face, and also some of the emerging challenges that we're sort of seeing. I wanted to share from not just from the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, but also from my own space of work and also being a member of the African diaspora, some of the issues that you would see sort of from a migrant's perspective of an African off the continent. And I wondered whether you know, as a space, when we're talking about advocacy, what we see as the shrinking space, as we see as the limited space, I think, for advocacy. And this is for civil society organizations or basically non-state actors in general, in terms of being provided the platform to raise pertinent issues in global discourse, but also particularly being asked to not being included in the setting of global agendas. And I wondered maybe that as we have been sharing these platforms and throughout this series, indeed what we've been trying to do is to move that sticky middle. So those that, you know, we know those who are converted, so those who understand the need or the messages that we send out in advocacy, but there is still a big part in different parts of society, whether we're talking about issues related to social cohesion or social exclusion of migrants, and that goes all the way from community members, but also to political systems, to economic provisions, and also societal structures. And where do we sort of see that movement? And maybe even through this series, what would have been also important for us to highlight is some of these solutions that we have seen maybe in small gestures or solutions we've seen also in smaller bits or smaller initiatives or initiatives that haven't taken up too much scale. And the idea with that is that there is a scalability that could be possible. The idea with that is that there could be an additional voice that could be added. There could be learning that takes place from an initiative that's happening in the Americas, and that kind of learning is transported to a totally different region where they're facing similar challenges as well. So the possibility for us to learn in these platforms, I think, is always very important. And I also just wanted to thank the co-organizers, particularly the panelists, from really sharing very genuinely from your experiences and being guided by the work that you're doing on the ground. I also wanted to kind of just share as a last point in terms of some of the issues that migrants would face, for instance, in Europe or in places that, you know, in the Balkans, for instance, and in other parts of the region where we have this closure. So the closed borders. So closed borders have been an issue, not just during COVID, but they continue to be an issue. And by closed borders, maybe not just thinking about it in terms of a physical space, but also in terms of the limited pathways that we continue to see see, despite the huge number of migrants that try to make it across using irregular channels. And what can we do as civil society, but what can we do also as those who work around civil society in elevating some of these issues to these particular global platforms? And we are hoping that through a space like this, mechanisms such as the Global Compact on Migration, the Global Forum on Migration, and the Global Forum for Migration and Development are able to pick out what is essential from these particular spaces and be fed and inspired by some of the work that civil society are doing. Now, somebody would say there's always been inspiration, right? We're not out of inspiration. But I think the bigger point is that we shouldn't run out of steam, because a lot of times we do run out of steam, that we can get a lot of energy from gathering together in spaces like this, not just in sharing our experiences, but really sharing and leveraging on what seems to be the working solutions from the various sides. And I think we've all heard, for instance, the impact that happened with Ukraine and the invisibility that was there with non-Ukrainians that had to cross over and find safety in other places. Those continue to be issues for a lot of migrants that still remain scattered in different places, that still don't have a proper pathway or even a protectorate directive, a real protection directive that talks about their safety and their concerns and their basic needs being provided for on a land away from their own. But also, we also see those who have returned home and have become sort of these returnees that have sort of been left to wander and join, obviously, the large number of the vulnerable in their own populations. And so I think that there's a bigger call for us to be able to look out, for returned populations, as well as we are looking, as we are talking about issues that have to do with migrants in general. But just thought to add my 2 cents there to the moderator, and thanks for the session today.
Thank you very much, Patty, for your inputs. In the interest of time, I would like to call on one last intervention from the floor before we go back to our speakers. Sihem, I see your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Oui, bonjour, ravie d'être parmi vous. Je suis
Thank you. It's a
Sihem.
pleasure to be here with you. My name is Siham Bouazam. I am a municipal councillor. I am a member of the civil society, and I'm very active on the national, regional, and international networks of the relevant associations. I wish to actually raise a question, or raise a question mark. We, as a Tunisian civil society, which is highly committed, as you already know, especially post 2011, and which is unable to find the proper information, the government is not involving the civil society in its actions, in its statements, or in any matter that is related to the very important issues of migration, let alone the fact that the other partners of the Tunisian government, namely Italy, Europe, so the remaining countries, and all other brothers and sisters from the African continent, they are not contacting the Tunisian organizations or the civil society in Tunisia, which means that we lack information. All the informations that we receive are contradictory. We do not have any validated or proven information. Every day we have new information that actually contradict what we have received yesterday and what we are to receive tomorrow. This is why I think that lacking the exact information and data is a matter that is very important. The civil society cannot proceed in any advocacy and cannot work on these issues. And this is actually unfortunate, especially for the Tunisian civil society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your sharing and intervention. Now I would like to go back, in the interest of time, I would like now to go back to our speakers for their closing intervention. And if they for the closing intervention, if you could focus in terms of what are your plans in terms of pushing the advocacy forward, and how do you see this link up with broader issues in your region? How can this advocacy on migration and human rights intersect with other movements? And how can we work in collaboration with other human rights movements, social justice movements in terms of the issue of migration and human rights? So again, I'd like to call on first Ellen, followed by Alma and Philip.
Yeah, thank you, Tatsi. I think I already made some comments on the question, but for this last intervention, I just would like to share with our participants today that for the Women Migrant Forum, our preoccupation in these coming days and weeks would be towards strengthening, consolidating, and expanding the Migrant Women Forum. Of course, as we do this, we have already identified some of the urgent issues that we need to do as well. For example, one would be on capacity building. We are a mix of diverse groups of women migrants, and in terms of the level of skills as well. So for example, how do we appreciate and put and apply, for example, the principles and articles of CEDAW and the general recommendations. So we need to engage in capacity building in terms of skills and knowledge of these standards and policies, and what do you mean exactly by rights-based gender responsive framework, etc. So we have to do a lot of these things. At the same time, we have to address identify pressing issues around women migrants. For example, the whole issue of access to health and sexual reproductive health services, issue of gender-based violence, understanding it further and how this may be stopped and combated, access to justice, inclusion in social protection, trying to fight exclusion and discrimination towards against women migrant workers. So I think we have a whole lot on our plate, but we are taking it in stride because we would like to get also as many of the active women migrants in the destination countries on board in this Women Migrant Forum, because I think it is important that they themselves take up the issue of promoting their rights and their welfare and dignity. No, so at the same time, yeah, definitely I heard the other colleagues saying that women, that we all deserve decent work conditions. And I would end by saying that definitely we have to continue to uphold and advocate that women migrant work is work. So we did that. This is our slogan or motto with when we did our campaign for the adoption of the ILO Convention in 89, that decent work is work. But definitely women migrant work is work. And they are all deserving of decent work conditions, which includes, of course, rights at work, social protection, and definitely the right to form or join trade unions. And finally, speaking of right to form trade unions or join trade unions, I think one happy news again in the region is the formation on June 16th, which is International Domestic Workers Day, the formation of the General Union of Domestic Workers in Bahrain. So I see somebody here from Bahrain, and I don't know if she's part of General Union of Domestic Workers in Bahrain, but it's one good news and one that is worthwhile to celebrate on the occasion of International Domestic Workers Day. So I end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for sharing some of the dates, and also for sharing about future plans in terms of advocacy for the region, and how we need to work together more to strengthen the advocacy on migrants' rights, especially for women migrant workers. And the good news on the General Union of Domestic Workers in Bahrain. Thank you very much for sharing that. We really need to celebrate updates like progress like this, given that it took so many years for us to advocate for rights of domestic workers and migrant domestic workers. So thank you very much for your intervention. I would like to call on to give the closing intervention, Alma Makito, if you're still online, if you could.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It has been an honor to be here and to be learning from my colleagues, people on the floor and the panelists. So thank you for the opportunity. I think it's important for us at the very least, like to offer two starting points to really reimagine migration governance, and one is to ensure the centrality of human rights. And for us, it's not only advocating for human rights in international policy spaces or national policy spaces, but it's also about building or using human rights as an umbrella to build conversations, to build solidarities, and to build leadership at the grassroots level, which is something that we're using. One of our main strategies at the National Network. We are really focusing on building the social justice or human rights infrastructure on the border. It's an infrastructure that has been decimated over the years due to not only like the increasing attacks of the far right that has come down on labor organizing, on human rights organizing, and really closing a lot of the political spaces for participation, but it's also the ineffective ways and abandonment of the political, the center in the United States. So it's not only the right, but it's also the center right in the United States. So we do not have our only alternatives for economic development on the border, for instance, are militarism and surveillance. Those are the primary jobs that we have here in our community. And that really creates a situation in which border communities endorse and depend on these type of military infrastructure for their survival. And so we're working with grassroots communities to try to build the human rights analysis and understanding, and working with other communities, with other frontline communities, working on the intersections of labor rights organizing, climate change, environmental justice, youth leadership, LGBTQ communities, to really build a transformative process that can allow us to build the political power to create change at the local level, at the state, and at the national and obviously international levels. So in order for us to do that, in order for us to really impact some of the national and international conversations, we really need to be focusing on developing more grassroots leaders and that organizing and social justice infrastructure that I think has been missing in our current approaches. So that I think that's all that I want to say, and for us also not to lose track of two key considerations. One of them is to ensure that we have a racial justice analysis to all of our work that can allow us to really look at the implications and the dimensions of the racialized dynamics on the bodies of indigenous peoples, you know, brown and Black communities that are racialized in the migration processes. And the other thing as well is for us to attend the urgency of climate change and to really kind of divert from engaging in the conversation of border crisis to really engage and advocate for engaging in more substantive discussions about climate change and the regularization or the creation of regular pathways. Thank you.
Thank you very much for putting emphasis on the need to focus on these key issues and the urgency to look at the issue of climate crisis, not just border crisis, but looking at climate crisis as it really impacts a lot of all of us, and the need for ensuring racial justice analysis in all our interventions, and also the need to look at collaboration with different organizations looking at climate justice as well. And thank you again for participating today in the webinar and for your interventions. I would like to call on next Philip, if you are still online. I hope you are still connected. If you could give some your closing remarks, last remarks. If you can, if you are still able to connect. If you're still online, Philip. Okay, we're not hearing back from Philip. I'd like to call on now Milena, if you're still online, for your closing remarks in terms, if you could, Milena, are you still online?
Yes, I am.
Yes. If you could give your closing remarks and share with us what are your what is in the future priority work for you, and how can we work together with the broader social justice movement?
Definitely. Thank you so
Yes.
much for this great discussion, and for all speakers and panelists for contributing to it. The Migration, Youth and Children platform conducted regional reviews on the Global Compact for Migration, where 4 main themes emerged from the regional consultations as key priorities for youth with regards to the implementation of the GCM specifically. With the first one being on discrimination and social cohesion, the second one on employment and skills development opportunities, the third one on access to education and recognition of qualifications, and the fourth one on access to services and information as critical needs for young people on the move, whether in countries of origin, transit, or destination. With regards to discrimination and social cohesion, we identified youth initiatives such as implementing buddy systems in schools in Europe to connect migrant children and youth to local peers, to fight discrimination and xenophobia by creating spaces for discussion and integration, such as workshops, sport activities, and cultural events, which encourage the development of relationships between migrants and local communities, but also implementing mentoring programs in schools to provide integration support and assist children with their homework, and creating a public campaign and direct action against discrimination and racism, focusing on key spaces of exclusion, such as, for example, schools. With regards to employment and skills development opportunities, we identified that there is a need to provide volunteer and work opportunities for young migrants inside youth organizations, allowing them to gain local experience, but also implementing training and skills in trades, for example, in aesthetics or other initiatives aimed at young people between the ages of 16 and 25, with the objective of enabling them to position themselves in the labor market and supporting migrants' economical and social inclusion through soft skills building programs and employability support, as well as intensive language training, matching the chosen areas of work and study. With regards to the access to education and recognition of qualifications, which I've touched upon already before, we identified that there's a need to establish programs to identify children in situations of vulnerability, specifically in Italy and Greece, including migrants, and providing them with the ability to return to school, but also providing alternative education and language competency classes for migrant children and youth, and funding digital devices and networks access costs for displaced children to continue education in situations, for example, the pandemic. with regard to the last point on access to information and services, where we have identified a lack of communication between the different levels of government, non-governmental organizations, and other organizations delivering services to migrants as a core issue in navigating the migration system. We're advocating for the creation of organizations to assist migrants in accessing resources such as career planning, education advice, any assistance and mentoring, but also building initiatives to link migrants with local facilitators who can help them navigate existing bureaucratic channels and provide access to local support systems such as enrollment in local schools. I will stop here now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Milena, for your closing and for emphasizing on the urgent issues that need to be addressed for the youth, for the youth migrants. And I would still like to call Philippe, if you're still online, if you would like to give your closing remarks. Are you still able to connect? Okay. I don't think he will be able to connect anymore. But so thank you very much, everyone, for participating in our webinar this evening. This is episode 6 of the John Kennedy Bingham Memorial Series of the People's Migration Challenge. Thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. And to our speakers, thank you very much for your sharing, for letting us know the urgent and relevant issues from your region and how we can move forward in terms of the advocacy. Please stay tuned to our social media pages to look at what will come next after this, what topic will come next in terms of our webinar series in the John Kennedy Bingham Memorial Series. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you also to the co-organizers of this program for all your support. Thank you. And we apologize again for starting the webinar late and for ending the webinar late. Thank you. And have a good day to everyone, and good night to those who are in Asia.